Ancient Faith Radio presents Speaking the Truth in Love with Father Thomas Hopko. Father Thomas is the Dean Emeritus of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary and the author of numerous books and articles. From his study in Elwood City, Pennsylvania, here is Father Tom.
It's an extraordinarily beautiful Saturday afternoon. I'm in the Laurentian Mountains in Quebec in Canada, all alone in my house here, our house. I'm looking out the window at the spectacular leaves, which, as a matter of fact, have already peaked probably this past week, and they're beginning to fall quite rapidly now. But the colors are indescribable. The yellow and the red with the green, and then the dark evergreen trees and the white birch trees, the trunks of the white birch trees. It's just unbelievably beautiful. And today the sky is blue and is filled with puffy white clouds. And this is very nice too, since it's been kind of overcast and rainy for the last several days. I'm looking out the window. I have my bird feeder out there. Chickadees come, and northern shrikes and nuthatches. And then every once in a while, huge blue jays come the size of chickens, and they chase the smaller birds away. But it's just also wonderful. And when observing all of this on this Saturday afternoon, can't help bringing together with it my thoughts and reflections about all the terrible suffering that's going on in all possible ways on this earth. You look at television, you look at films that people are making, you look at specials. I was watching the special about Charles Darwin the other day on Nova. And then, of course, I have my books that I read, and I have the seemingly incessant telephone calls that come in, and almost all have to do with terrible suffering, affliction, sadness, spiritual, emotional, physical, interrelational, familial. A lot of it is sexual. It's just so sad on the one hand, and so extraordinarily beautiful on the other. And when you put this together, at least when I do, I just have this incredibly overpowering conviction that this cannot possibly all be for nothing. How could such beauty and how could such suffering simply be meaningless? How can it simply be just for nothing? Some kind of passing joy or sadness or whatever that ultimately has no meaning whatsoever. It just ends in the grave. It ends in corruption. Because the law in this world is that everything does end in death. It ends in death. Everything. The leaves on the trees, the birds on my bird feeder. You who are listening, I who am sitting here, it's ultimately all doomed. Unless it would be saved by God. Of course, there are those who believe in some kind of spiritualism, that the material world means nothing, that the trees and the birds and the sky ultimately mean nothing, that our sufferings and afflictions and sadness and tears ultimately mean nothing, that only the spirit somehow will survive, and either, if you're a Platonist, it'll go off to some world to contemplate the spiritual realities of the ideal world. If you have another philosophy, it might be believed that we just keep reincarnating, coming back and back again until we reach some type of nirvana or some type of, absorption into the one where we lose our consciousness and our personal existence. And there's some kind of resolution of everything in just some kind of monad being, which I guess even some people might even call God. I don't know. But what I do know is that in my mind, the only thing that makes sense is Christ and Him crucified. The only thing that makes sense is the incarnation of the Son of God. For the sake of taking upon Himself the sin of the world and recreating the whole of creation through the shedding of His blood on the tree of the cross. In our Orthodox Church on Pascha, that's how we sing. We say, let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad. We say that every tone 3, every 8 weeks on Sunday we sing it. Not only the heavens, the angels, the earth, but the mountains, the hills, the trees of the forest. You know the psalm that says, let all of the trees of the forest rejoice today. And it's funny, it says, let them rejoice because Christ is hanged upon a tree. In fact, that's one of the things our Holy Fathers say. He had to be crucified on a tree because the trees have to rejoice. The tree has to participate. But when he sheds his blood, as St. Gregory, the theologian, said, one drop of that blood recreates the whole creation. The human being, the birds, the animals, the plants, everything that exists. And then all of our tears are washed away. All of our suffering is brought to completion. The supernatural reason for our suffering is even revealed. It's amazing, you know. I read recently in a book, I don't have it with me now, where Scott Cairns, the poet, wrote a book about suffering called The End of Suffering, where he quoted Simone Weil, who said something like this. I don't have the words in front of me, but she said something like this. There is no real supernatural explanation of human affliction and suffering, but there certainly is a supernatural reason for it. There is a divine reason for our suffering, human suffering. And then St. Paul, we remember, said even that all of creation is in travail and groaning until the revelation of the sons of God. I really think about that when I've been thinking about Charles Darwin and evolution. And, you know, this is the year of Darwin's 200th anniversary of his birth, 150 years since the publication of The Origin of the Species, his theory of natural selection. I don't know, somehow I think that there's a whole lot of truth in that theory, that it is all in travail and groaning and agony. As the poet Tennyson said, you know, the tooth and fang red with blood in creation. But all this has a supernatural, if you want to put it that way, an eschatological, divine destiny in God, where it will all be fulfilled in God, and it will all be what it is supposed to be in the shalom, in the great peace of God at the end. At the end. And so it strikes me today again how certainly our Christian faith is a remembrance of Christ, a remembrance of his coming, a remembrance of his teaching, a remembrance of his passion, a remembrance of his suffering and his death, and a remembrance of his resurrection from the dead, and his glorification, and his seating at the right hand of the Father, with that imagery meaning, of course, that he reigns on the very throne with God Almighty himself, who is in fact his eternal Father, and he is his eternal Son, who becomes a historical figure on the planet Earth named Jesus. We remember all those things, and it's not just a remembrance. And perhaps even in some sense more than a remembrance, it's an expectation, an anticipation of what is coming. You know, I love how the scripture says in the Apocalypse, that line about he who sits upon the throne, about him who sits upon the throne, that is God Almighty, and about the Lamb who is enthroned with him, which is the Son, Jesus. And it says, he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the Archi and the Telos. But he is also called the one who was, the one who is, and the one who is coming. In fact, the order is more accurately, he who is, Ho'on, he who was, Ho'in, and not he who will be, but he who is coming, Ho'erhomenos, the one who is coming. And so we live every day on these beautiful days when we contemplate the beauty and feel the suffering and the agony that people are going through. People in our own families, our own sons and daughters, our spouses, our parents, our neighbors. All that affliction is going on, but we live in it remembering and expecting him who is coming, the risen Christ, who will reveal this whole creation as the temple of God, and who will show that there is a meaning and a purpose in everything that happens. And no leaf falls from a tree as Christ said, no bird from the air, no tear from any human being's eyes, without meaning, without purpose, without finding its end, as Scott Cairns the poet writes, its end in the coming kingdom. And he plays on the word end. You might want to read his book, The End of Suffering, published by Paraclete Press in New England. Scott Cairns, C-A-I-R-N-S, the poet, who also published a wonderful book called Love's Immensity, where he rewrites sayings of church fathers in modern American poetic style. Just a wonderful book, a wonderful book. But he plays on that word end, because end means both purpose and it means end. The end, the final, chronological act, the end of suffering, the purpose and the final resolution. Now, thinking all these things on this beautiful Saturday afternoon, when tomorrow, by the way, the gospel reading will be from Luke about how Jesus raises up the son of an only widow, the widow of Nain. I think we all are familiar with that chapter, with that story. I'll read it to you. It said, Jesus went to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the city, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said to her, do not weep. And he came and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up, and he began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among his people. God has visited his people. And this report concerning Jesus spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. We know that Jesus raised a few dead people, not many. Jairus' daughter, the only son of the widow, Lazarus, all of whom died again, to show that he is the resurrection and the life, and that we will all be raised to everlasting life, not simply to more life in this world, but to everlasting life. And there's a sense in which, I once heard a preacher say this in a sermon, that you can feel almost sorry for that boy. He was dead. His earthly life was over. And most likely his earthly life was an affliction. Because if he was the only son of a widow, it meant he was an orphan without siblings. He had no father and no brothers and sisters, and he was all alone in the world with a widowed mother. And at that time, the widows and the orphans were at the mercy of their neighbors. They didn't have, I should say, people can complain about SSI and welfare programs and so on, and some people even think, well, they just give out free money to lazy bums. But we do know there are plenty of orphans and plenty of widows and plenty of single moms and dads and plenty of children, orphan children. In fact, just this week, Project Mexico had its board meeting that builds houses for people who have no houses and provides an orphanage for boys who have no homes. But we know nowadays, governments take care of those things somehow, other people do. But at the time of Jesus, as we know from the Bible, even before Jesus, the widows and the orphans had to be cared for. And according to Mosaic law, it was the duty of God's people to care for these people. And we have to keep caring for them today. But when you think of that boy being raised from the dead for more life in this world, as the preacher I heard once said, he said, in some sense you could feel sorry for that boy. Because when he died, his own afflictions were over. His mother was left alone, but his afflictions were over. Now he's raised up for what? As John Chrysostom says, for more crosses, for more afflictions, for more troubles. He's got to take care of that mom. And hopefully he's going to get cared for by other people, but he's going to be at the mercy of other people too. What kind of a life is that? And then as he grows older, he's going to have to work and take care of his mother, and who knows how long she's going to live. So you think about all those things, and then you just thank God that there is an end to suffering in the two senses that the poet writes about. An end meaning a purpose, a reason, and also an end meaning simply a final, chronological, historical end. There are these two meanings, and we contemplate them this day, this beautiful day. But we have to think further, at least I'm thinking further today. It struck me so much, something that a wonderful woman wrote in one of her letters in the 1970s. It just came to me today, and I'd moved to share it with you. The woman's name was Lydia Gysi. Lydia Gysi was a German-speaking woman. I believe that she may have been from Austria rather than from Germany. But in any case, she studied in Germany, and she had a doctorate in philosophy, which was kind of rare at the time of her youth. She was an assistant to the very famous philosopher named Edmund Husserl, whom I had to read a lot when I was studying philosophy in my youth. Husserl was called a phenomenologist. But this woman, Lydia Gysi, G-Y-S-I, she herself was a Platonist, and she was very close and friendly with some Platonistic philosophers. Can't remember their names now. I don't have the book with me here right now in the Laurentian Mountains. But today I'm thinking in these mountains about this Lydia Gysi because of something she wrote in a letter that I read. This Lydia Gysi was a kind of in a sense, a convinced Platonist herself. She had a kind of Platonic view of things, but not the Platonism of the spiritual ideas as much as the Platonism of the dialectic, the Platonism of yes and no and back and forth and so on. But that doesn't really matter now. What matters is that this Lydia Gysi went to France, and she, somehow or other, I don't even know how, she began to work with a Russian Orthodox nun named Maria Skoptsova. And this Maria Skoptsova, Mat Maria, is now herself a canonized saint of the Orthodox Church, together with Father Dmitry Klepinin and her own son, biological son, Yuri, and her friend Ilya Fundaminsky, who was a Jewish man who converted to Christianity. And this Mother Maria, the nun, the Russian Orthodox nun, she had a place in Paris where they took care of the poor, the needy, the outcast. And this Mother Maria, the nun, she was kind of like a Mother Teresa of Calcutta type person. She was actually a bohemian kind of person. She was an SR in Russia, a social revolutionary type person. She was the mayor of a town. She was the mistress of a famous poet, Alexander Blok. She was a friend of a very conservative Russian Orthodox man who was the Oberprokurator of the Holy Synod and the Russian Orthodox Church. His name was Konstantin Pobedonostsev. She was a very, incredible person, this Mother Maria. She was an artist herself, a poet herself. She was a painter. She did embroidery. She was all kinds of things. But what happened with this woman, this Mother Maria, her name originally was, I believe it was Nadia Pilenko. But in any case, she got kind of reconverted to the Christian faith. And in Paris, having been twice married, divorced, whatever, she smoked cigarettes and God knows what. But in any case, she, and also was an associate of people like Berdyaev and that whole intellectual circle in Paris of Russian immigrants, she became a nun. Metropolitan Yevlogy of the Russian Orthodox Church of Western Europe consecrated her as a nun, and for the purpose of working among the poor. And so she had this house on Rue Lurmel, I believe it was, and her son Yuri helped her there, and Ilya Fundaminsky, and Konstantin Malchulsky, who wrote a big, famous book on Dostoevsky, and her priest at that monastery, the house for the needy, was a man named Father Dmitry Klepinin. Well, what happened during the Second World War was these people began to protect Jews. And they harbored the Jews in their little monastic center, kind of a center, charitable center, philanthropic for all of these Russian, taxi drivers and street people and alcoholics. And this Mother Maria, she would go every day to Les Halles, a place in Paris where there was all food being, old rotten food being thrown away. And she'd go through there and get it all and bring it and feed these poor and needy people in her house. But then they began protecting Jews. And in fact, they even made some fake baptismal certificates to try to save people's lives. Well, to make the story short, they got caught. The Gestapo caught them, the Nazis took them to the prison camps, and they all perished. In fact, Mother Maria actually died on Good Friday afternoon in the place of a Jewish woman who survived because the camp was liberated only a couple of days later. But she perished in this prison camp in Ravensbrück. You could read about her. She's a saint, canonized saint of the church, Mother Maria Skoptsova, and Father Dmitry Klipinin, and Yuri Skoptsov, and Ilya Fundaminsky. I have an icon of them that some woman painted for me. So I shouldn't say some woman, a wonderful woman, wonderful iconographer named Cheryl Petuch. She painted an icon for me, which I have in my corner at home. But why I'm mentioning these people is that this philosopher lady, the learned lady Lydia Gysi, she began to work with these people. And then she converted to the Orthodox Church. And then she became a nun herself. She went to England and she asked the Metropolitan Anthony of Suroz, Archbishop Anthony Bloom, a famous man in Russian Orthodoxy in our time. And he accepted her into the church, and she wanted to be a nun. And when he accepted her and tonsured her, he also gave her the name of Maria. So she also was called Mother Maria. And she lived in England, and I guess Archbishop Anthony didn't know quite what to do with her. They didn't have Russian Orthodox convents, at least in his jurisdiction, and so on. So he actually, strangely enough, he put her into live with some Anglican nuns. And she lived among them for a long while. And then what happened was that she and two of the Anglican nuns who decided to join the Orthodox Church, one was named Catherine, the other was named Thekla, the three of them went up into the north in England, and they founded a little monastery up there. And so the three of them were living in this monastery in northern England, Mother Maria, Mother Catherine, and Mother Thekla. And they actually produced a number of books. Mother Maria wrote about the Jesus prayer. She wrote about Platonism and Christianity. She wrote about the prophets of the Old Testament. She wrote a number of books which still exist. Most of them are very tiny books, almost pamphlet-sized books, booklet books. But they're really interesting to read because in some sense they're very idiosyncratic. She had her own kind of particular view of how to bring everything together. And they're really worth reading. But what also happened was that this Mother Maria, Lydia Gysi, who, by the way, I can just mention in passing, that she had a goddaughter when she was working in Paris. She had a goddaughter who came to join her. The woman who came to join her, her name was Claudia. She was a daughter of a Lutheran pastor. And she joined the Orthodox Church, and she ended up marrying a Russian man who ended up becoming a Russian Orthodox priest. And she and her husband are the parents of Father John Baer, who's now the dean of St. Vladimir Seminary, and Father Evdokimos Baer, who's a monk on Mount Athos, and Macrina, who is Hopko, by the way. She's married to our son Johnny, who's Father John in Terryville, Connecticut. But it's so amazing in my life that the goddaughter of this particular woman would herself become the wife of a Russian Orthodox priest and have three children whom I know extremely well and am very close to. But in any case, this Lydia Gysi, the philosopher, became a Russian Orthodox nun with the name of Maria. And then she and her two friends, converts also, Catherine and Thekla, they went to the north of England and had a little monastery. And actually, they entered into the ecumenical patriarchate. And when Mother Maria died, I believe it was Metropolitan Kallistos Ware who actually anointed her when she was ill. She suffered from cancer, suffered greatly, very terrible suffering. And then I believe that when she reposed in the Lord, it was Metropolitan Kallistos and his colleagues who did her funeral. But in 1970s, the Paulist Press in New Jersey published her letters. Thekla and Catherine collected her letters that she had sent to people. And the Paulist Press in New Jersey published these letters. They're called the Letters of Mother Maria. I believe the book's out of print. I wish it would be republished. Maybe some publishing company can consider doing that. But why I'm mentioning all of this on this Saturday afternoon here in the Laurentian Mountains of Quebec is because in one of her letters, she wrote something that really struck me today. It just came back into my mind, and I thought, I'm going to tell the people on the radio about this. In one of her letters, she wrote that she had once in her life, and only once, what she really believed was a kind of extraordinary mystical experience, a kind of supernatural locution or vision. She says it's hard even to describe what it was. Is it a dream? Was it a vision? How did it come to her? But she said she will never, ever deny that this wasn't real. And she said it was the one and only time, never happened again, anything like this, but this one thing she was convinced was genuine. And this is what it was. She, with her sisters, were very, very unhappy with how their monastery was developing, because it wasn't developing. No new people were coming. They thought that it might, create other women who would come and join them, but they didn't come. They had difficulties with finance. They had difficulty with church politics. They had difficulty with jurisdictions. They had difficulties with the neighbors. They had all kinds of difficulties, all kinds of afflictions. And the worst thing was that they felt that, at least Mother Maria felt, that, what they were doing maybe wasn't worth it. Maybe it wasn't blessed by God, Maybe they were in delusion of some sort. And then she kept being totally preoccupied with all the troubles around her, especially ecclesiastical troubles, which we in America know only too well, don't we? Every church has those ecclesiastical troubles. Well, she had all kinds of troubles that people would have. And certainly the one thing that's promised people who follow Jesus Christ is that they will have troubles. In fact, the Lord says in St. John's Gospel, in the world you will have afflictions, sufferings, but take courage and be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. But she would forget that. And she would just get immersed in their human, all too human life and be very despondent and very depressed and really wondering why it was all happening that way, why it had to be that way, why couldn't it be better, why couldn't they be better, why couldn't their monastery grow, why couldn't the church take care of them better, why weren't people interested, why? She was asking all these questions and was getting darker and depressed and all this kind of thing. And then she said in this letter to her friend that I read in that book, published in the 1970s by Paulus Press, she said to this friend, she said, only once in my life did I have this, what I would consider like a supernatural gift from above. And then she described how she was convinced that it was the Theotokos. It was Mary, the mother of Christ, the Panagia, the All-Holy One, spoke to her. And she said the words were crystal clear and unforgettable. They were kind of indelibly inscribed in her heart. And this is what the Theotokos, she says, said to her. She said, the Holy Mother of God said to me, Maria, it's not what you think. Maria, it's all quite different. What did that mean? It's not what you think. It's all quite different. And she reflected on that in the letter. I can't recall now exactly what she said, but what I remember her saying, or at least what I heard her say, was this. We could get all caught up in the externals of our life. Our successes, our failures, how big our churches are, how big our monasteries are, how many people come, how united we are, how our bishops behave, how they misbehave, how we all misbehave, how all pathetic we are, how, the institutions, they may even be corrupted and all this kind of stuff. We could get all caught up in that and think that that's what it's about. But this Mother Maria said that the Holy Mary, Mother of God, said to her, that's not what it's about. It's not what it's about. It's all quite different. It's not what you think. You're getting all caught up about stuff that doesn't even matter at all. Well, how can you say that? How can it not matter? How can it not matter that there's ecclesiastical problems and difficulties and competitions and madness and the corruption and, all that we experience on a daily basis, not only in this world, but in the churches, in the very churches, in our own families, in our own monasteries. I mean, when I'm an old man now, and boy, when I look back, boy, it's pretty horrible. Something when you look at it humanly. I mean, I reflected recently on the 46th anniversary of my ordination and said, wow, so much was disappointing. There was so much good too. But Mother Maria said that the Mother of God probably meant something else. What she meant, it seems, when she said, it's all quite different. It's not what you think. God sees it differently. It could mean that what she was saying was this. What the Lord God Almighty is interested in is the person. Each soul, each person, each one with a face and a name. And all he's interested in is, what did that person do with her or his life? How did that person behave? How did that person work? How did that person relate to his family members or to his brother monastics or sister monastics? How did they relate to their bishops and their priests? If that person was a bishop or a priest, how did he relate? How did he do his job? How did he fulfill his ministry or fail in his ministry? In other words, what this Mother Maria thought was being told to her by the Theotokos is, you can look at the institutional things. You can look at what's going on officially. You could look at, the meetings and the conferences and the statements that can come from everywhere from Chambézy to Rome or whatever, Mount Athos or whatever. You could look at all that kind of stuff. But what really matters is the person involved, and what that person does or does not do. How that person behaves. How that person, we have to say it, bears his or her cross. How that person deals with the afflictions that we will have in this world, this gorgeous, beautiful world with the blue sky and the puffy white clouds and the chickadees and the nuthatches on the bird feeder and the beautiful leaves falling off the trees. How does the person behave in all of that? How does a person bear her cross or his cross in the midst of all of that? And then you could say, is the person contributing to the malaise, to the darkness, to the competition, the envy, the power struggles, the competitions, the accusations, the self-defenses? Or is that person dealing with those things without being poisoned by them? As Solzhenitsyn, who pops into my head today also, said in his contemplation of the prison camps in Soviet Union, he said, when you're a prisoner in a prison camp, he said, there's only three things you can do. He said, you can give in and be crushed by all the evil. You could give up and just join in and become evil yourself. You could give up and be crushed, or give in and become part of the problem, part of the trouble, part of the affliction, inflicting afflictions on other people. Or you can trust God, believe in God, pray for His grace, and suffer those afflictions knowing that there is an end of those afflictions. An end in Scott Cairns' terms as a purpose, and an end in his terms as a chronological end at the end of the ages. So it's all quite different. What we think is important, God probably doesn't think is that important. You know how many people are in the monastery? It's not that important. Even Orthodox unity in America or something, it's not that important. Oh, it's important, but not really what's at stake. even the union among Christians. Whatever it is we think of, nations, economy, the gross national product, whatever we want to think of, the income in our parish, we can get all upset about many of those things, but that's not really what's important. It's all quite different. It's not about that. It's about each individual person and communion between persons and how they act and behave in the midst of their afflictions in this beautiful world. And so it's all quite different. It's all quite different from what we are so often, we might even dare almost say always, virtually always, concerned about and even obsessed about, and get obsessed over and drive ourselves into darkness and despair. And the demons then win. Can't do that. So we look at the person. And first and foremost, we look at our own self as a person. And each one of us says to ourselves, okay, here is a beautiful world filled with afflictions and darkness and sins and wickedness of all kinds, even in the churches. But here I am too. Here I am. And I'm still living in this world. Unlike the only son of the widow, I wasn't dead and resurrected again, but maybe spiritually in some sense I was. You know the song Amazing Grace. I was dead and now I'm alive. Or the prodigal son. The son was dead and now he's alive again. He was lost, now he's found. Well, at some point we've got to be alive and we've got to be found. And when we are alive and when we are found, we're no longer interested in external things. We're no longer interested in institutional things. We're no longer interested at first or in most important about money, income, numbers, impact, influence, presence in society, and all that kind of stuff. It's all quite different. We come to know it's all quite different. All that matters is the person. And therefore, for me, all that matters is my life. What do I do with my own life? What do I do with my afflictions, my sufferings, my temptations, my trials, the tests that are given to me in this tribulation of this world, which, naturally speaking, is just so unbearably beautiful? What do I do? Because that's what God is interested in. What do I do? What do I do today? And I can say, well, what I do right now, today on this Saturday afternoon, is to try to share these thoughts with you through the radio. What you do, wherever you are and whenever you're listening to this, is what you do today. But every day we have something to do. We get up in the morning. We have things to do. We have a schedule. We go through the day. And at night we go to sleep again, God willing. And in the morning we wake up again, God willing. And all that God really cares about is who we are as a person and what we do with our personal life in the place, at the time, with whom and from whom and for whom we live. May God bless us. May God bless us not to be caught up in those things that we think are so important. Let's hear the word of Mother Maria. And when we think of Mother Maria, her monastery did not succeed. It didn't. The three of them died. No new nuns came. I believe at the moment one monk is living there in their property, I think. I'm not even sure of that. But humanly speaking, you could say what they did was a failure. She didn't succeed. She had every good reason to be depressed and despondent about her monastery, because as a matter of fact, it didn't work. However, since everything is all quite different, and since it's not what she thought, well, we can see what happened. Here we are in 2009 thinking about her. Here we are in 2009 hearing her words. We can read her books too if we want to. We could read her letters if we want to. And here we are in 2009 in the fall, the beautiful fall day. We're remembering that the Mother of Christ our God said to her one day, however that happened, she said to Mother Maria, Mary, the Mother of God, said to the nun, Mother Maria, it's all quite different. It's not what you think. thanks be to God for Mother Maria. And her life was fulfilled perhaps even in just that one sentence that we can quote today. Who knows? Who knows? I'm sure she did many other wonderful things. But one thing's for sure. If there's only one thing that she gave to us, who knows what God thinks of her life? But that one thing that she gave to all of us today are those words of the Mother of God. It's all quite different. It's not what you think. For Ancient Faith Radio, this is Father Thomas Hopko.
And that was Speaking the Truth in Love with Father Thomas Hopko. Father Tom is Dean Emeritus at St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary. This is a listener-supported production of Ancient Faith Radio.